Hi, PerspectaWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Monday, April 8th. Even though we have a couple of more cold shots coming into the eastern part of the nation over the next few weeks, it's about time we take a look at the tropical outlook for the Atlantic Basin. We'll also focus in on the Mid-Atlantic summertime outlook. Anytime I do seasonal forecasts, I like to first focus in on sea surface temperatures around the world. And indeed, there's an existing El Nino right now in the tropical part of the Pacific Ocean. It looks like it'll maintain its strength over the next several months and be a major factor in the tropical outlook for the Atlantic Basin. Before we look forward, let's take a look back at 2018. It was the third year in a row with above normal tropical activity in the Atlantic Basin. It will be long remembered, however, for two storms in particular. One was Hurricane Florence, which reached the Carolinas and then kind of ran into an atmospheric brick wall in the early part of September. It stopped its northward progress and actually was forced back south and west along the eastern part of the Carolinas, and it dumped tremendous amounts of rain on the Carolinas in the early part of September. Then, shortly after that, within a month after that, Hurricane Michael right here slammed into the Panhandle region of Florida, and it was one of the strongest hurricanes ever recorded to slam into the Panhandle region of Florida. So again, 2018 was the third year in a row of above normal activity. All of that, by the way, followed 10 years of quieter than normal activity in the Atlantic Basin, but 2018 will long be remembered for Florence and Michael. One of the interesting parts about 2018, it looked like it might be an El Nino type of tropical season, and that typically inhibits tropical storm formation in the Atlantic Basin, but La Nina held on longer than expected. El Nino did not really get kicking until late in the fall or even during this past winter season. Well, speaking of sea surface temperatures, here is the anomaly map of just a few days ago, and a couple areas of interest I want to point out with respect to the tropical outlook in the Atlantic Basin. First and foremost, we have this El Nino right here, way above normal sea surface temperatures, right along the equator. This is the equator line right here, the equator latitude right there, and this is El Nino. It got underway during the past winter season. All indications are it will continue to maintain its strength, perhaps even intensify a bit in magnitude over the next few months, perhaps even continuing into the fall or winter season later this year, going into the winter season of 2019-2020. So that is a major factor. El Nino in the tropical Pacific actually has an impact on the tropical part of the Atlantic, mainly in two ways. It tends to increase upper level wind flow. Upper air speeds tend to increase even in the tropical Atlantic when there's an El Nino in the equatorial part of the Pacific Ocean. That higher wind shear tends to inhibit the formation of tropical storms, or indeed if a tropical storm does form, it'll inhibit the intensification of that tropical system. El Nino also tends to be correlated well with sinking motion in the tropical part of the Atlantic Ocean. Again, an inhibiting factor for the formation or intensification of Atlantic Basin tropical storms. In the Atlantic, mixed signals. First of all, here is the all-important west coast of Africa. We, of course, get a lot of African waves that move along from the east to the west, riding along the trade winds, especially during the early and middle part of the tropical season. But notice here, and let's clear the cards here so we can see this better. Notice here, colder than normal conditions in the tropical Atlantic, especially just off the west coast of Africa. That, again, is an inhibiting factor. Tropical storms tend to require sea surface temperatures of at least 80 degrees. Even better would be 85 degrees or higher. But anytime you have colder than normal conditions off the west coast of Africa, that, along with El Nino, can be an inhibiting factor to Atlantic Basin tropical storm formation or intensification. Notice, however, the mixed signal here in the sense that warmer than normal conditions kind of dominate the western Atlantic all the way into the Gulf of Mexico, and even the Caribbean Sea has some warmer than normal conditions. That is a positive influence on tropical storms. It tends to help with tropical storm formation, or if indeed there is a tropical storm, it helps with intensification. So again, kind of mixed signals going on in the Atlantic Ocean with this kind of ring of cooler waters out here across the eastern Atlantic, but in the western Atlantic, some warmer than normal conditions. I often talk about homegrown type tropical systems that can impact the east coast or the southern coast of the U.S., and that is what I fear for later this summer, going into the fall, some homegrown type tropical hits on the U.S., and that's primarily due to the warmer than normal waters over the Bahamas, near the east coast, and over the Gulf of Mexico region. You could see storms forming in those areas and then perhaps hitting the Gulf Coast or the East Coast, and we'll of course watch for that later this year. But certainly El Nino plays a major role this summer from the tropical Pacific and the mixed signals coming from the Atlantic Ocean. Well, one reason why we have a lot of confidence that El Nino will continue is this compilation of forecasts from all kinds of computer forecast models. We have a couple types of computer forecast models: dynamical models and statistical models. The statistical models tend to rely on statistics only, whereas dynamical models rely on statistics and also real-time conditions. Almost all of these models continue with a moderate strength El Nino. This particular line here is the neutral line. Anything shown above this line is El Nino conditions. Anything below it, La Nina conditions. The higher above that neutral line, the stronger the El Nino. Strong El Ninos typically are considered whenever there's a 2.0 on this particular sea surface temperature anomaly plot here. So we're not expecting a strong El Nino, but basically this green line here represents the middle point of all these computer forecast models, and it runs along right through the summer. This, by the way, are rolling 3-month periods. For example, this is July, August, September, all the way into the end of the year, November, December, January. Basically El Nino conditions, and primarily between 0.5 and 1.0. In other words, weak to moderate El Nino. And again, that will play an inhibiting role in the formation of tropical storms in the Atlantic Basin. One of the reasons I believe this will be a slightly below normal average year in the Atlantic Basin. Well, in addition to those almost universal forecast model forecasts of El Nino over the next several months, which continue El Nino, this particular type of plot of sea surface temperature anomalies is quite important. It supports the idea that El Nino will continue, and also, by the way, supports the idea that the Western Atlantic will stay warm, because what we're looking at here are the sea surface temperature anomalies below the surface in the highest 300 meters of the Pacific Ocean or Atlantic Ocean, whatever the case may be, and we're seeing very warm waters below the surface. So not only is it already warmer at the sea surface level itself, the top of the ocean, but for the highest 300 meters below the surface, very warm waters. So any kind of churning in the water will continue El Nino for the next several weeks and perhaps a few months here. So this is supporting evidence that El Nino will continue. This is, of course, the equator right here, and this is in the central part of the equatorial Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, notice here in the Western Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of warmer than normal temperatures in the highest 300 meters. Warmer than normal on this particular map shown right down here on this kind of a color scheme here. Colder than normal shown by the blues and purples. So again, at the highest 300 meters from the surface of the ocean on below, warmer than normal condition. In the Gulf of Mexico, some very warm waters just below the surface. So any kind of a mixing there that happens with the passage of a storm system, for example, you could get warmer water rising up to the top, and a continuation of warm waters compared to normal in the Western Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the equatorial part of the Pacific Ocean. Well, how about the Mid-Atlantic region in terms of summertime outlook here? And basically, I believe it'll be a wetter than normal summer and a warmer than normal summer season, but not an excessively hot summer. This is the soil moisture anomaly for the month of March, as we ended the month of March, and as probably not surprisingly to most people here, very wet soil conditions in the eastern half of the nation. We've had a wet pattern not only in California here in recent months, but in the eastern half of the nation for the last several months, really at least a year or so of wetter than normal conditions. With wet soil conditions, that reduces the chance for any kind of an excessively hot summer. The way the atmosphere is warmed up in the summertime is the sun actually heats the ground, and in turn the ground heats the lower part of the atmosphere. Anytime you have excessive moisture, the top layers of the soil of the ground, some of the sun's energy is actually used up in the evaporation of that soil moisture. So any kind of a moist soil will kind of reduce the possibility of excessive heat in the lower part of the atmosphere. In other words, the excessively hot summers are usually correlated with drought conditions. Definitely does not look like we'll have any kind of a drought anywhere in the eastern U.S. We've been very wet for the last several months. No reason to believe that wet pattern will stop anytime soon. So again, I believe we'll be warmer than normal, maybe 1, 2, 3 degrees on average over the summer season in the Mid-Atlantic region, but not an excessively hot summer. Probably continue also with the wetter than normal conditions for the June, July, August time period. So basically wet and warm, and that tends to correlate with high relative humidities, kind of uncomfortable nights, likely this summer in the Mid-Atlantic region. Well, let's summarize everything in the executive summary. By the way, all the plots I've gone through in this video discussion are available at the posting right now on the weather website, as is this executive summary. First of all, largely because of El Nino in the tropical Pacific, I expect that to be an inhibiting factor for Atlantic Basin tropical stormation and intensification, and therefore overall I expect this to be a slightly below normal tropical season with perhaps around 11 named systems, 5 hurricanes, and 2 majors. This will be less active than last summer and actually less active than the last 3 summers. Again, slightly below normal activity I expect this summer in the Atlantic Basin, and El Nino will play a major role. There are mixed signals coming out right now from the Atlantic Ocean. We saw kind of a ring of colder than normal conditions, an inhibiting factor for tropical storm formation, especially when there's colder than normal waters off the west coast of Africa. On the other hand, the Western Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico has some very warm water, warmer than normal, and as we saw a moment ago, a lot of warm water just beneath the surface that could easily come up to the surface over the next few months. That area of warmer than normal can lead to what I call homegrown type storms that can impact the U.S., especially the East Coast and the Gulf Coast regions. And usually those kind of storms occur in the middle or latter part of the tropical season. Finally, we just talked a moment ago, looks like a warmer and wetter than normal type of summer for the Mid-Atlantic region with high relative humidities. Given that high soil moisture content, that could lead to some uncomfortable nights in the June, July, August time period. So that's it for now. Obviously, we will monitor all of this over the next several weeks and months to go. For PerspectaWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Dorian.